To the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The senators, please be seated. If there is no objection, the journal of proceedings of the trial are approved to date. Hearing no objection, so ordered. The Sergeant-at-Arms will make the proclamation.
Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. All persons are commanded to keep silent on pain of imprisonment while the Senate of the United States is sitting in a trial of the articles of impeachment exhibited by the House of Representatives against Donald John Trump, President of the United States.
Mr. Justice.
The Majority Leader is recognized.
For all of our colleagues, some information about scheduling. Today we'll plan to take short breaks every 2 to 3 hours, and we'll accommodate a 30-minute recess for dinner, assuming it is needed, until the House managers have finished their opening presentation. For scheduling purposes, we've organized tomorrow's session to convene at 10 a.m. and run for several hours as the President's Counsel begins their presentation.
Pursuant to the provisions of Senate Resolution 483, the managers for the House of Representatives have 7 hours and 53 minutes remaining to make the presentation of their case. The Senate will now hear you.
Mr. Chief Justice, Senators, distinguished counsel of the President, I keep wanting to say good morning, but good afternoon. I just wanted to give a very brief orientation to the argument you'll hear today. We will begin with Jason Crow, who was talking about the conditionality of the military assistance. This is the latter part, although not the end of the argumentation on the application of the Constitution and law as it respects Article 1, the abuse of power. I'll have a presentation after Mr. Crow, and soon thereafter we will conclude the presentation on Article 1. We'll then begin the presentation on Article 2, once again applying the Constitution and law to the facts on the President's obstruction of Congress. We will then have some concluding thoughts and then turn it over to the President's Counsel. And that is what you should expect for the day. And with that, I will now yield to Mr. Crow of Colorado.
Good afternoon. I woke up this morning and walked to my local coffee shop where, unlike my esteemed colleague, Mr. Jeffries from New York, nobody complained to me about Colorado baseball. So I could only conclude that this is only a New York Yankees problem. As Mr. Schiff mentioned, we talked last night about the July 25th call and the multiple officials who had confirmed the intent of the President in withholding the aid. So now I'd like to turn to what happened around the time that the aid was lifted. And we know that the aid was lifted ultimately on September 11th, but it wasn't lifted for any legitimate reason. It was only lifted because President Trump had gotten caught. Now let's go through how we know that. On August 26th, the whistleblower complaint had been sent to the Director of National Intelligence. And public reports indicate that President Trump was told about the complaint by White House counsel Pat Cipollone. On September 5th, though, the scheme became public. An editorial in the Washington Post on that day, for the first time publicly, explicitly linked the military aid hold in the investigations that President Trump wanted. Now keep in mind that public scrutiny of the President's hold increased exponentially after this became public. And this is where things start moving really fast. A few days later, on September 9th, the House investigative committees publicly announced their investigation of President's conduct in Ukraine. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman testified that the National Security Council and others at the White House learned about the investigation when it was announced. And a colleague of his said that it might have the effect of releasing the aid. And on that same day, the House Intelligence Committee learns that the administration had withheld the whistleblower complaint from Congress. The scheme was unraveling. And what happens 2 days later? President Trump released the military aid. He only released it after he got caught. But there's another reason we know the president lifted the aid only because he got caught. Because there's no other explanation. The testimony of all of the witnesses confirms it. Both Lieutenant Colonel Vindman and Ms. Williams testified that they were not provided any reason for lifting the hold. Vindman testified that nothing on the ground had changed in the 2 months. And Ambassador Taylor, too, testified that, quote, "I was not told the reason why the hold had been lifted." Now let me take a moment to address another defense I expect you will hear. That the aid was released and the investigations were never announced, so therefore, no harm, no foul, right? Well, this defense would be laughable if this issue wasn't so serious. First, I've spoken over the past 3 days about the real consequences of inserting politics into matters of war. Real people, real lives are at stake. Every day, every hour matters. So no, the delay wasn't meaningless. Just ask the Ukrainians sitting in trenches right now. And to this day, they are still waiting on $18 million of the aid that hasn't reached them. Jennifer Williams, who attended the Warsaw meeting with Vice President Pence, described President Zelensky's focus during this time.
And you testified in your deposition that in that conversation, President Zelensky emphasized that the military assistance, the security assistance, was not just important to assist Ukraine in fighting a war against Russia, but that it was also symbolic in nature. What did you understand him to mean by that?
President Zelensky explained that more than, or just equally with the financial and physical value of the assistance, that it was the symbolic nature of that assistance that really was the show of U.S. support for Ukraine and for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And I think he was stressing that to the Vice President to really underscore the need for the security assistance to be released.
And that if the United States was holding the security assistance, is it also true then that Russia could see that as a sign of weakening U.S. support for Ukraine and take advantage of that?
I believe that's what the President Zelensky was indicating, that any signal or sign that U.S. support was wavering would be construed by Russia as potentially an opportunity for them to strengthen their own hand in Ukraine.
This is an important point, particularly when the president and his attorneys try to argue no harm, no foul. The financial assistance itself was really important to Ukraine, no question about it. But the aid was equally important as a signal to Russia of our support for Ukraine. And regardless of whether the aid was ultimately released, the fact that the hold became public sent a very clear signal to Russia that our support for Ukraine was wavering. And Russia was watching very closely for any sign of weakness. The damage was done. Now, any possible doubt about whether the aid was linked to the investigations has been erased by the president's own chief of staff. Now, we've seen this video before during the trial, but there's a really good reason for this. It's a complete admission on national TV that the military aid was conditioned on Ukraine helping the president's political campaign. Here, once again, is what Mulvaney said.
Did he also mention to me in the past the corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely. No question about that. But that's it. And that's why we held up the money.
And when pressed that he had just confessed to the very quid pro quo that President Trump had been denying, Mulvaney doubled down.
happened as well.
We do that all the time with foreign policy. If you read the news reports and you believe it, what did McKinney say yesterday? McKinney said yesterday that he was really upset with the political influence in foreign policy. That was one of the reasons he was so upset about this. And I have news for everybody. Get over it. There's going to be political influence in foreign policy. I'm talking to Mr.
Now remember, at the time he made these statements, Mulvaney was both the head of OMB and the acting chief of staff at the White House. He knew about all of the legal concerns. He also knew about the president's so-called drug deal, as Ambassador Bolton called it. He knew exactly what was going on in the Oval Office and how OMB implemented the president's illegal order to hold the aid. Mulvaney confirmed why the president ordered the hold. It was not to develop further policy to counter Russian aggression. It was not to convince the Ukrainians to implement additional anti-corruption reforms, and it was not to pressure our allies to give more to Ukraine. Now, since we won't have an opportunity to respond to the president's presentation, I'm going to take a minute to respond to some of the arguments that I expect them to make. You will notice, I'm sure, that they will ignore significant portions of the evidence while trying to cherry-pick individual statements here and there to manufacture defenses. But don't be fooled. One defense you may hear is that the aid was held up to allow for a policy review. This is what the administration told the GAO at one point. But the evidence shows the opposite. The evidence shows that the administration didn't conduct a review at any time after the president ordered the hold. Laura Cooper was not aware of any review of the funding conducted by DOD in July, August, or September. And similarly, George Kent testified that the State Department did not conduct and was never asked to conduct a review of funding administered by the State Department. In fact, on May 23rd, the anti-corruption review was complete and DOD certified to Congress that Ukraine had complied with all of the conditions and that the remaining half of the aid should be released. This was confirmed by the June 18th press release announcing the release, or announcing the funding. And do you remember the fictitious, quote-unquote, interagency review process? Well, that was made up, too. So no review was necessary because it had already been done. Next, the President's Counsel keeps saying this was about corruption in Ukraine. President Trump was not concerned with fighting corruption. It's difficult to even say that with a straight face. The president never mentioned corruption on either call with President Zelensky. But let's go through the evidence. As we just discussed, DOD had already completed a review and concluded that Ukraine had, quote, made sufficient progress in meeting defense reform and anti-corruption goals consistent with the National Defense Authorization Act in order to receive the funds. And in fact, Mark Sandy, who was not at that meeting, but who was initially responsible for approving the hold, said he had never heard corruption as a reason for the hold in all of the discussions he had about it. Similar to the anti-corruption argument, there is simply no evidence to support the president's after-the-fact argument that he was concerned about burden sharing. Now, that's other countries also contributing to Ukraine. I imagine the president may cite the emails in June about what other countries provided to Ukraine, the reference to other countries' contributions in the July 25th call, and testimony from Sandy about a request for information about what other European countries give to Ukraine. But there is simply no evidence that ties the concern to his decision to hold the funding. First, let's actually look at the contributions of European countries to Ukraine. There's a slide in front of you. It shows that other European countries have significantly contributed to Ukraine since 2014, and the European Union in total has given far more than the U.S. The EU is the single largest donor to Ukraine, having provided over $16 billion in grants and loans. The president's assertion that other countries did not support Ukraine is meritless. And there are other reasons, too. After DOD and OMB responded to the president's request, presumably with some of the information we just provided you, showing Europe gives a lot to Ukraine, nobody in the Trump administration mentioned burden sharing as a reason for the hold to any of the 17 witnesses that we've been talking about. Sondland, whose actual portfolio is the EU, not Ukraine, testified that he was never asked to speak to the EU or EU member countries about providing more aid to Ukraine. And if President Trump were truly concerned about that, he would have been the perfect guy to handle it, because he was our ambassador to the EU. But it never happened. And how could it? Because Sondland himself knew the aid was linked to the investigations, because that's what the president himself had told him. It wasn't until the president's scheme began to unravel, after the White House learned of the whistleblower complaint, and after Politico publicly revealed the existence of the hold, that the issue of burden sharing came up again. If the president's concern were genuinely about burden sharing, he never made any public statements about it, never ordered a review of burden sharing, and never ordered his officials to push Europe to increase their contributions. And then he released the aid without any changes in Europe's contributions. This last point is important. You know the president's purported concern about burden sharing rings hollow because the aid was released after the president got caught, not because the EU or any European country made any new contributions. As Lieutenant Colonel Vindman testified, the facts on the ground had not changed. Finally, you may hear the president's counsel say that Ukraine didn't know about the hold until August 28th, long after the hold was implemented, so therefore they could not have felt pressured. But this makes no sense. First, they found out about it long before August 28th. Multiple witnesses testified that the Ukrainians showed, quote, impressive diplomatic tradecraft in learning quickly about the hold. And of course, they would know. The DoD release was announced in June, and U.S. agencies knew about it in July. So it should be no surprise that the first inquiries about the aid were on July 25th, the same day as the call. You see, it doesn't matter if extortion lasts 2 weeks or 2 months. It's still extortion, and Ukraine certainly felt the pressure. Other Ukrainian officials also expressed concerns that the Ukrainian government was being singled out and penalized for some reason, and they were, by President Trump. And you know how else you know they felt the pressure from the hold? Because President Zelensky finally relented and was planning to do the CNN interview. Ultimately, right around the time of President Zelensky's conversation with President Trump, which is the subject of the classified document that I urge all senators to look at, President Zelensky canceled the CNN interview. But the damage was already done. The evidence is clear. The question for you is whether it's okay for the president to withhold taxpayer money, aid for our ally, our friend at war, for a personal political benefit. Whether it's okay for the president to sacrifice our national security for his own election. It's not okay to me. It's certainly not okay with the American people. And it should not be okay to any of you.
Mr. Chief Justice, distinguished members of the Senate, President's Council, the American people, once again, we are gathered here not as Democrats or Republicans, not as the left or the right, not as progressives or conservatives, but as Americans, doing our constitutional duty during this moment of presidential accountability. And as House managers, we thank you for your courtesy, your attentiveness, and your hospitality. At the heart of Article 2, obstruction of Congress, is a simple, troubling reality. President Trump tried to cheat. He got caught, and then he worked hard to cover it up. The president tried to cheat, he got caught, and then he worked hard to cover it up. Patrick Henry, one of the nation's great patriots, once said that the liberties of a people never were, nor ever will be secure when the transactions of their rulers may be concealed from them. Let's now address the effort by President Trump and his team to cover up his wrongdoing. By July of 2019, White House officials were aware of serious allegations of misconduct by President Trump regarding Ukraine. But instead of halting the president's corrupt scheme, they worked overtime to conceal it from the American people. As additional evidence of the president's wrongdoing mounted, White House lawyers redoubled their efforts to prevent Congress and the American people from learning of the president's misconduct. At the same time, top administration officials, including Secretary of State Pompeo, Secretary of Defense Esper, and National Security Advisor John Bolton, tried to convince President Trump to lift the hold on the security assistance. They failed. President Trump was determined to carry out his corrupt scheme. The military and security aid was only released on September 11th, after the hold became public, after the House launched an investigation, and after Congress learned about the existence of a whistleblower complaint. The $391 million in security aid was only released because President Trump was caught red-handed. The actions of President Trump and high-level White House officials allowed his abuse of power to continue beyond the watchful eye of Congress and, most importantly, the American people. As we have discussed at length, on July 10th, Ambassador Sondland told the Ukrainians and other U.S. officials that he had a deal with Acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney to schedule the White House meeting President Zelensky wanted if the new Ukrainian leader committed to the phony investigations that President Trump sought. As you've seen in testimony shown during this trial, following that meeting, National Security Council officials Dr. Fiona Hill and Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman immediately reported this information to John Eisenberg, the legal advisor for the National Security Council and a deputy counsel to the president. According to Dr. Hill, Mr. Eisenberg told her that he was also concerned about that July 10th meeting. On the screen is Dr. Hill's deposition testimony, where she explains Mr. Eisenberg's reaction, saying, he wasn't aware that Sondland, Ambassador Sondland, was kind of running around doing a lot of these meetings and independently. We talked about the fact that Ambassador Sondland said he'd been meeting with Giuliani, and he was very concerned about that. And he said that he would follow up on this. Mr. Eisenberg was very concerned about that and said that he would follow up on this. Dr. Hill further testified that Mr. Eisenberg told her that he followed up with his boss, the distinguished White House counsel, Pat Cipollone. However, because the president blocked Mr. Eisenberg from testifying in the House, we do not know what, if anything, he or Mr. Cipollone did in response to this deeply troubling information. What we do know is that President Trump's effort to cheat continued with reckless abandon by failing to put the brakes on the wrongdoing after that July 10th meeting, even after they were notified by concerned national security officials. the White House attorneys allowed it to continue unchecked. Right around the same time that the July 10th meetings at the White House took place, the Office of Management and Budget began executing President Trump's illegal order to withhold all security assistance from Ukraine. On July 12th, Robert Blair, an assistant to the president, communicated the hold to the acting director of the Office of Management and Budget, Russell Vought. On July 18th, an Office of Management and Budget official communicated the hold to other executive branch agencies, including the Department of State and the Department of Defense. And a week later, on July 25th, President Trump had his imperfect telephone call with President Zelensky and directly pressured the Ukrainian leader to commence phony political investigations as part of his effort to cheat and solicit foreign interference in the 2020 election. The July 25th call marked an important turning point. If there was any question among senior White House officials and attorneys about whether President Trump was directly involved in the Ukraine scheme, as opposed to just a rogue operation being led by Rudolph Giuliani or some other underlings, after July 25th, there can be no mistake. The President of the United States was undoubtedly calling the shots. Thereafter, the complicity of White House officials with respect to the cover-up of the president's misconduct intensified. Immediately after the July 25th call, both Lieutenant Colonel Vindman and his direct supervisor, Tim Morrison, reported their concerns about the call to Mr. Eisenberg and his deputy, Michael Ellis. In fact, within an hour after the July 25th call, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman returned again a second time to Mr. Eisenberg and reported his concerns.
I was concerned by the call. What I heard was inappropriate, and I reported my concerns to Mr. Eisenberg. It is improper for the President of the United States to demand a foreign government investigate a U.S. citizen and a political opponent. I was also clear that if Ukraine pursued an investigation, it was also clear that if Ukraine pursued an investigation into the 2016 elections, the Bidens and Burisma, it would be interpreted as a partisan play. This would undoubtedly result in Ukraine losing bipartisan support, undermining U.S. national security, and advancing Russia's strategic objectives in the region. I want to emphasize to the committee that when I reported my concerns on July 10th relating to Ambassador Sondland, and then July 25th relating to the President, I did so out of a sense of duty. I privately reported my concerns in official channels to the proper authority in the chain of command. My intent was to raise these concerns because they had significant national security implications for our country. I never thought that I'd be sitting here testifying in front of this committee and the American public about my actions. When I reported my concerns, my only thought was to act properly and to carry out my duty.
Timothy Morrison, the National Security Council's Senior Director for Europe and Russia, also reported the call to Mr. Eisenberg and asked him to review the call, which he feared would be damaging if leaked.
Now, Mr. Morrison, shortly after you heard the July 25th call, you testified that you alerted the NSC legal advisor, John Eisenberg, pretty much right away. Is that right?
Correct.
And you indicated in your opening statement, or at least from your deposition, that you went to Mr. Eisenberg out of concern over the potential political fallout if the call record became public, and not because you thought it was illegal. Is that right?
Correct.
But you would agree, right, that asking a foreign government to investigate a domestic political rival is inappropriate, would you not?
It's not what we recommended the president discuss.
The July 25th call was at least the second time that National Security Council officials had reported concerns about President Trump's pressure campaign to White House lawyers. The second time, who now clearly understood the gravity of the ongoing misconduct. But because the president blocked Mr. Eisenberg from testifying without any justification, the record is silent as to what, if any, actions he or the White House counsel took to address misconduct and abuse of President Trump's brazen misconduct and abuse of power. That instead of trying to halt the scheme, that instead of trying to halt White House lawyers facilitated it. White House lawyers taking affirmative steps to conceal evidence by taking affirmative steps to conceal evidence of President Trump's misconduct. After Lieutenant Colonel Vindman and Mr. Morrison reported, after Lieutenant Colonel Vindman and Mr. Morrison related to the July 25th call to the National Security Council lawyers, they tried to bury the call summary. They tried to bury it. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman testified that the National Security Council lawyers believed it was, quote, appropriate to restrict access to the call summary for the purpose of the leaks and to preserve the integrity of the transcript. According to Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, Mr. Eisenberg gave the go-ahead to restrict access to the call summary. Mr. Morrison testified that he learned in late August, after he raised concerns that the call record might leak and politically damage the president, that the call summary had been placed on a highly classified National Security Council server. The call record was placed on a server that is reserved for America's most sensitive national security secrets and covert operations, not routine calls with foreign leaders. Apparently, Mr. Eisenberg claimed at the time that burying the call transcript on a highly classified server was a mistake.
Now, in a second meeting with Mr. Eisenberg, what did you recommend that he do to prevent the call record from leaking?
I recommended we restrict access to the package.
Had you ever asked the NSC legal advisor to restrict access before?
No.
Did you speak to your supervisor, Dr. Kupperman, before you went to speak to John Eisenberg?
No.
Did you subsequently learn that the call record had been put in a highly classified system?
I did.
And what reason did Mr. Eisenberg give you for why the call record was put in the highly classified system?
It was a mistake.
He said it was just a mistake?
It was an administrative error.
In Mr. Morrison's view, the July 25th call record did not meet the requirements to be placed on a highly classified server. At his deposition, Mr. Morrison testified that the call record was placed on the server by mistake. However, even after this alleged mistake was uncovered, the July 25th call summary was not removed from the classified system because someone was trying to hide it. It was not until the launch of the House impeachment inquiry in late September and after intense public pressure that the rough transcript of the July 25th call was released. Again, because Mr. Eisenberg and Mr. Ellis refused to testify in the House. We do not know exactly how the July 25th call record ended up on this highly classified National Security Council server. What we do know is that Mr. Eisenberg ordered access restricted after multiple officials like Dr. Fiona Hill and Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, advised him of the scheme to condition a White House meeting on phony political investigations. This strongly suggests that there was an active attempt to conceal the clear evidence of the president's wrongdoing. Instead of addressing the president's misconduct, Mr. Eisenberg seemingly tried to cover it up. Why did Mr. Eisenberg place the July 25th call summary on a server for highly classified material? Did anyone senior to Mr. Eisenberg direct him to hide the call record? Why did the call record remain on the classified server even after the so-called error was discovered? Who ordered the cover-up of the call record? Who ordered the cover-up of the call record? The American people deserve to know. Following the July 25th call, the president's scheme to pressure Ukraine for political purposes intensified, apparently unchecked by any effort to stop it from the White House counsel's office. After the July 25th call, Ambassadors Sondland and Volker worked with the president's personal lawyer, Rudolph Giuliani, to procure a public statement from President Zelensky to announce phony investigations into Joe Biden and the CrowdStrike conspiracy theory being peddled by President Trump. At the same time, President Trump continued to withhold the White House meeting and security assistance from Ukraine in a manner that broke the law. As these efforts were ongoing, White House attorneys reportedly received yet another warning sign that the president was abusing his power. According to a published report in the New York Times, the week after the July 25th call, an anonymous whistleblower reported concerns that the president was abusing his office for personal gain. The whistleblower complaint landed in the CIA General Counsel's office. Although the concerns related directly to the president's own misconduct, the CIA's General Counsel, Courtney Elwood, alerted Mr. Eisenberg. Over the next week, Ms. Elwood, Mr. Eisenberg, and their deputies reportedly discussed the whistleblower's concerns, and they determined, as required by law, that the allegations had a reasonable basis. So, by early August, White House lawyers began working along with attorneys at the Department of Justice to cover up the president's wrongdoing. They were determined to prevent Congress and the American people from learning anything about the president's corrupt behavior. Although senior Justice Department officials, including Attorney General Bill Barr, were reportedly made aware of the concerns about corrupt activity, no investigation into President Trump's wrongdoing was even opened by the Department of Justice. As White House and Justice Department lawyers were discussing how to deal with the whistleblower's concerns, on August 12th, another important date, the whistleblower filed a formal complaint with the Inspector General for the intelligence community. In accordance with federal law, on August 26th, the Inspector General transmitted the whistleblower complaint to the Acting Director of National Intelligence, Joseph McGuire, along with the Inspector General's preliminary conclusion that the complaint was both credible and related to a matter of urgent concern. Urgent concern. But instead of transmitting the whistleblower complaint to the House and to this Senate's Distinguished Intelligence Committee, as required by law, the Acting Director of National Intelligence notified the White House.
Well, Director, I'm still trying to understand the chronology. So you first went to the Office of Legal Counsel, and then you went to White House counsel?
We went, excuse me, and then to the, repeat that, please, sir?
I'm just trying to understand the chronology. You first went to the Office of Legal Counsel, and then you went to the White House counsel?
No, sir. No, sir. No, we went to the White House first to determine, to ask the question.
Okay, that's all I wanted to know is chronology. So you went to the White House first. So you went to the subject of the complaint for advice first about whether you should provide the complaint to Congress.
There were issues within this, a couple of things. One, it did appear that it has executive privilege. If it does have executive privilege, it is the White House that determines that. I cannot determine that as the Director of National Intelligence.
Under federal law, the acting director of national intelligence was required to share the whistleblower complaint with Congress. Period. Full stop. If that had occurred, the president's scheme to withhold security assistance in a White House meeting being sought by the new Ukrainian leader to pressure Ukraine for his own personal political gain would have been exposed. To prevent that from happening, the president's lawyers and top-level advisors adopted a two-pronged cover-up strategy. First, block Congress and the American people from learning about the whistleblower complaint. Second, try to convince President Trump to lift the hold on the security assistance before anyone can find out about it and use that evidence against him. As to the first prong, sometime after the acting director of national intelligence told the White House counsel's office about the complaint on August 26th, Mr. Cipollone and Mr. Eisenberg reportedly briefed the president. They likely discussed with President Trump whether they were legally required to give the complaint to Congress. They stated that they were consulting with the Office of Legal Counsel at the Department of Justice. The acting director of national intelligence testified that he and the Inspector General consulted with the Office of Legal Counsel, who opined without any reasonable basis that he did not have to turn over the complaint to Congress. On September 3rd, the day after the statutory deadline for the Director of National Intelligence to provide the complaint to this body and to the House, the Office of Legal Counsel issued a secret opinion, concluding that, contrary to the plain language of the statute, the acting director of national intelligence was not required to turn over the complaint. The cover-up was in full swing. The Office of Legal Counsel opined that the whistleblower complaint did not qualify as an urgent concern and therefore did not have to be turned over. What can be more urgent than a sitting president trying to cheat in an American election by soliciting foreign interference? What can be more urgent than that? That's a constitutional crime in progress. But they concluded it wasn't an urgent matter. Acting Director of National Intelligence McGuire testified that the Office of Legal Counsel opinion did not actually prevent him from turning over the complaint to Congress. Instead, based upon his testimony, it is clear that he withheld it on the basis that the complaint might deal with information that he believed could be covered by executive privilege. But President Trump never actually invoked executive privilege. He never actually invoked executive privilege. Nor did he inform Congress that he was doing so with respect to this complaint. Instead, the White House secretly instructed the acting director of national intelligence to withhold the complaint based on the mere possibility that executive privilege could be invoked. By doing so, the White House was able to keep the explosive complaint from Congress and the American public without ever having to disclose the reason why it was withholding this information. But truth crushed to the ground will rise again. There's a toxic mess at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and I humbly suggest that it's our collective job, on behalf of the American people, to try to clean it up. President Trump tried to cheat. He got caught. And then he worked hard to cover it up. There have been many great presidents throughout the history of this republic, great Republican presidents and great Democratic presidents. Perhaps one of the greatest presidents is Abraham Lincoln. He once said that any man can handle adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give him some power. America is a great nation. We can handle adversity better than any other country in the world. Whenever America has found itself in a tough spot, we always make it to the other side. We were in a tough spot during the Civil War, when America was at risk of tearing itself apart, but we made it to the other side. A tough spot in October of 1929, when the stock market collapsed, plunging us into the Great Depression, but we made it to the other side. We were in a tough spot in December of 1941, when a foreign power struck, plunging us into a great conflict with the evil empire of Nazi Germany, but America made it to the other side. We were in a tough spot in the 1960s, dealing with the inherent contradictions of Jim Crow, but we made it to the other side. We were in a tough spot on September 11th, when the towers were struck, and young men and women like Jason Crow was sent to Afghanistan to fight the terrorists there, so we didn't have to fight the terrorists here. And we made it to the other side. America is a great country. We can handle adversity better than any other nation in the world. But what are we going to do about our character? President Trump tried to cheat and solicit foreign interference in an American election. That is an attack on our character. President Trump abused his power and corrupted the highest office in the land. That is an attack on our character. President Trump tried to cover it all up and hide it from the American people and obstruct Congress. That's an extraordinary attack on our character. America is a great nation. We can handle adversity better than any other country in the world. But what are we going to do about our character?
Crisis around the president's hold deepened throughout our government. The president's own top advisors redoubled their efforts to lift the hold on military aid and stem the fallout in case it went public. And it did go public. On August 28th, Politico publicly reported that the president was withholding the military aid. And as you've heard, the public disclosure of the president's hold in late August caused deep alarm among Ukrainian officials. It also caused U.S. officials to redouble their efforts once again. At the end of August, Secretary of State Pompeo, Defense Secretary Esper, and Ambassador Bolton reportedly tried to convince President Trump to release the aid, but they failed. The president wanted the hold to remain. That prompted Duffy, the political appointee charged with implementing the hold, to send an email on August 30th to the DOD stating, and I quote, "Clear direction from POTUS to hold." Now, this is consistent with Laura Cooper's deposition testimony when she said that they were, quote, "hopeful this whole time that Secretary Esper and Secretary Pompeo would be able to meet with the president and just explain to him why this was so important and get the funds released." But instead, the president held firm. And even as the president's own cabinet officials were trying to convince him to lift the hold, White House lawyers were receiving new reports about the president's abuse. On September 1st, Vice President Pence met with President Zelensky in Warsaw, and immediately after, Sondland had a side conversation with the top Ukrainian presidential aide. Morrison was privy to these conversations, and when he returned from Warsaw, he reported to Eisenberg the details.
What did Ambassador Sondland tell you that he told Mr. Yermak?
That the Ukrainians would have to have the Prosecutor General make a statement with respect to the investigations as a condition of having the aid lifted.
And you testified that you were not comfortable with what Ambassador Sondland had told you. Why not?
Well, I was concerned about what I saw as essentially an additional hurdle to accomplishing what I had been directed to help accomplish, which was giving the president the information he needed to determine that the security sector assistance could go forward.
So now there's a whole other wrinkle to it, right?
There was the appearance of one based on what Ambassador Sondland represented.
And you told Ambassador Taylor about this conversation as well, is that right?
I promptly reached out to Ambassador Taylor to schedule a secure phone call.
And in your deposition, you testified that his testimony, other than one small distinction between President Zelensky and the Prosecutor General, was accurate as to what you told him. Is that correct?
About that conversation, yes.
And generally speaking, you confirmed everything that Ambassador Taylor told you, except for that one thing and a small other ministerial matter relating to the location of a meeting. Is that correct?
Correct.
Now, did you tell Ambassador Bolton about this conversation as well?
I reached out to him as well and requested his availability for a secure phone call.
And what was his response when you explained to him what Ambassador Sondland had said?
Tell the lawyers.
Did you go tell the lawyers?
When I returned to the States, yes.
And did he explain to you why he wanted you to tell the lawyers?
He did not.
Now, this wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last, that Ambassador Bolton instructed other government officials to report details of the president's scheme to White House lawyers. Now, let's be clear. When government employees have concerns about whether something is legal, they often go to their agency's lawyers. And it was happening an awful lot around this time. Recall that Bolton also instructed Dr. Hill to report to the lawyers Sondland's statements about requiring an announcement of the investigations as a condition for a White House meeting. What Bolton called Sondland's, quote, drug deal with the president's top aide, Mick Mulvaney. Ambassador Bolton's testimony would obviously shine further light on these concerns and what or who, if anyone at the White House or the cabinet, did to try to stop the president at this time. After the president's hold on military aid became public in late August, there was increasing pressure on the president to lift the hold. On September 3rd, a bipartisan group of senators sent a letter to acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney. And an excerpt from that letter is in front of you. The senators expressed, quote, deep concerns that the, quote, administration is considering not obligating the Ukraine Security Initiative funds for 2019. The senator's letter also urged that the vital funds be obligated immediately. On September 5th, the chairman and the ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee sent a joint letter to Mulvaney and OMB Director Russell Vought. That letter also expressed deep concern about the continuing hold on the military aid. The same day, Senators Murphy and Johnson visited Kyiv and met with President Zelensky along with Ambassador Taylor.
On September 5th, I accompanied Senators Johnson and Murphy during their visit to Kyiv. When we met with President Zelensky, his first question to the senators was about the withheld security assistance. My recollection of the meeting is that both senators stressed that bipartisan support for Ukraine in Washington was Ukraine's most important strategic asset, and that President Zelensky should not jeopardize that bipartisan support by getting drawn into U.S. domestic politics. I had been making, and continue to make, this point to all of my official Ukrainian contacts. But the odd push to make President Zelensky publicly commit to investigations of Burisma and alleged interference in the 2016 election showed how the official foreign policy of the United States was undercut by the irregular efforts led by Mr. Giuliani.
The senators sought to reassure President Zelensky that there was bipartisan support in Congress for providing the military aid. Also on September 5th, the Washington Post editorial board reported concerns that President Trump was withholding the aid, and a meeting to force President Zelensky to announce investigations to benefit his personal political campaign. The editors wrote, quote, "We're reliably told that the president has a second and more venal agenda. He is attempting to force Mr. Zelensky to intervene in the 2020 U.S. presidential election by launching an investigation of the leading Democratic candidate, Joe Biden. Mr. Trump is not just soliciting Ukraine's help with his presidential campaign, he is using U.S. military aid the country desperately needs in an attempt to extort it," end quote. Despite these efforts to get the president to lift the hold in the now public discussion about the president's abuse of power, the scheme continued. 2 days later, on September 7th, Morrison went back to White House lawyers to report additional details he had learned from Ambassador Sondland about the president's scheme, again, at the direction of Ambassador Bolton.
Now, a few days later, on September 7th, you spoke again to Ambassador Sondland, who told you that he had just gotten off the phone with President Trump. Isn't that right?
That sounds correct, yes.
What did Ambassador Sondland tell you that President Trump said to him?
If I recall this conversation correctly, this was where Ambassador Sondland related that there was no quid pro quo, but President Zelensky had to make the statement and that he had to want to do it.
And by that point, did you understand that the statement related to the Biden and 2016 investigations?
I think I did, yes.
And that was essentially a condition for the security assistance to be released?
I understood that that's what Ambassador Sondland believed.
After speaking with President Trump?
That's what he represented.
Now, you testified that hearing this information gave you a sinking feeling. Why was that?
Well, I believe if we're on September 7th, the end of the fiscal year, September 30th, these are one-year dollars, the DOD and the Department of State funds. So we only had so much time, and in fact, because Congress imposed a 15-day notification requirement on the State Department funds, September 7th, September 30th, that really means September 15th, in order to secure a decision from the President to allow the funds to go forward.
Did you tell Ambassador Bolton about this conversation as well?
I did, yes.
And what did he say to you?
He said to tell the lawyers.
And why did he say to tell the lawyers?
He did not explain his direction.
Again, tell the lawyers. Ambassador Sondland's call with President Trump on September 7th also prompted deep concern by Ambassador Taylor, which you've already heard about. On September 8th and 9th, Ambassador Taylor exchanged WhatsApp messages with Ambassadors Sondland and Volker describing his, quote, nightmare scenario, that, quote, they give the interview and don't get the security assistance. As he then goes on to say, quote, the Russians love it and I quit. After the hold on the military aid became public, the White House took two actions in early September. First, the White House and the Justice Department ensured that the acting DNI continued to withhold the whistleblower complaint from Congress, in clear violation of the law. And second, the White House attempted to create a cover story for the president's withholding of the assistance, approximately 2 months after President Trump had ordered the freeze. Mark Sandy received an email from his boss, Michael Duffy, that for the first time gave a reason for the hold. Sandy testified that in early September, he received an email from Duffy, quote, that attributed the hold to the president's concern about other countries not contributing more to Ukraine. Again, after months of scrambling, this was the first time any reason had been provided for the hold. And according to Sandy, it was also only in early September, again after the White House learned of the whistleblower complaint and the hold became public, that the White House requested data from OMB on other countries' assistance to Ukraine. So let's recap why we know the concern about burden sharing was bogus. First, for months, no reason was given to the very people executing the military aid, who had been actively searching for answers about why the aid was being held. Second, remember the supposed interagency process performed by OMB? Well, it was fake. And third, after the hold went public and the White House became aware of the whistleblower, they started scrambling to develop another excuse. Public reports confirm this. A November 24th news report, for instance, revealed that in September, Mr. Cipollone's lawyers conducted an internal records review. The review reportedly, quote, turned up hundreds of documents that reveal extensive efforts to generate an after-the-fact justification for the decision in a debate over whether the delay was legal. The president's top aides were trying to convince the president to lift the hold in late August and early September. And White House officials were actively working to develop an excuse for the president's scheme and devise a cover story in the event that it was exposed. And soon it would be. On September 9th, the chairs of the House Intelligence Committee, the Committee on Foreign Affairs, and the Committee on Oversight and Reform publicly announced the joint investigation of President Trump and Mr. Giuliani's scheme. And this is when the music stops and everyone starts running to find a chair. Word of the committee's investigation spread quickly through the White House to the NSC. Morrison recalled seeing and discussing the letter with NSC staff. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman also recalled discussions among NSC staff members, including Morrison's deputy, John Arath, about the investigation. The same day, there were efforts at OMB to create a paper trail that tried to shift the blame for the president's hold on security assistance away from the White House. Duffy sent an email to Elaine McCusker that contradicted months of email exchanges. It stated falsely that OMB had in fact authorized DOD to proceed with all process necessary to obligate funds. Duffy was attempting to shift all the responsibility for the delay onto the Pentagon. McCusker replied, and I quote, "You can't be serious. I am speechless." Now, all of this, including OMB's efforts to shift blame to the Pentagon, the White House's effort to create a cover story for the hold on security assistance, were a continuation of the cover-up. It started with the White House's lawyers' failure to stop the scheme after the July 10th meeting was reported to them, continued with attempts to hide the July 25th call summary, and escalated with the White House's illegal concealment of the whistleblower complaint from Congress. On September 10th, the House Intelligence Committee requested that the DNI provide a copy of the whistleblower complaint as the law requires. But DNI continued to withhold the complaint for weeks. The same day it was announced that Ambassador Bolton was resigning or had been fired. It is unclear whether Ambassador Bolton's departure from the White House had anything to do with his opposition to the hold on military aid, but of course, Ambassador Bolton could shed light on that himself if he were to testify. The next day, on September 11th, President Trump met with Vice President Pence, Mulvaney, and Senator Portman to discuss the hold. Later that day, the president relented and lifted the hold after his scheme had been exposed. The president's decision to release the aid, just like his decision to impose the hold, was never explained. Cooper testified that President Trump's lifting of the hold, quote, really came out of the blue. It was quite abrupt. The only logical conclusion based on all of this evidence is that the president lifted the hold on September 11th because he got caught. The president's decision to lift the hold without any explanation is also very telling. If the hold was put in place for legitimate policy reasons, why lift it arbitrarily with no explanation? By lifting the hold only after Congress had launched an investigation, when, as Lieutenant Colonel Vindman testified, none of the facts on the ground had changed since the hold had been put into place, the president was conceding that there was never a legitimate purpose. Since the hold was lifted, the president has paid lip service to purported concerns about corruption and burden sharing. But the administration has taken no concrete steps before or since those statements were made to show that it really cares. The record is clear. Before he got caught, the president had no interest in anti-corruption reforms in Ukraine. And as you've already learned, those people who really were concerned about these issues, like Congress, this Senate, the DOD, and the State Department, had already gone through the process to address them. As Ambassador Sondland testified, at no point did the president ask him to discuss additional contributions to Ukraine from EU countries, nor did President Trump push Ukraine to undertake any specific anti-corruption reforms. Now, the President's counsel will likely say that his lifting of the hold shows his good faith. They will say that because Ukraine ultimately received the aid without President Zelensky having to announce the sham investigations, that there was no abuse of power. As a legal matter, the fact that the president's corrupt scheme was not fully successful makes no difference. Trump's abuse occurred at the moment he used the power of the presidency to assist his re-election campaign, undermining our free and fair elections and our national security. But importantly, President Trump almost did get away with it. As discussed earlier, President Zelensky agreed during his September phone call with Ambassador Sondland to do a CNN interview during which he denounced the investigations. On September 12th, Ambassador Taylor personally informed President Zelensky and the Ukrainian foreign minister that President Trump's hold on military assistance had been lifted. And on September 13th, Ambassador Taylor and David Holmes met with President Zelensky and his advisors and urged them not to go forward with the CNN interview. It was not until September 18th and 19th, around the time that President Zelensky spoke with Vice President Pence, that the Ukrainians finally canceled the CNN interview. The president has also repeatedly pointed to President Zelensky's public statements that he did not feel pressured by Trump. Not only unsurprising, it's also irrelevant. The question is whether President Trump used the power of the presidency to coerce President Zelensky into helping him win a political campaign. But we know that President Zelensky was pressured. He kept delaying and delaying because he did not want to be a pawn in U.S. domestic politics. In fact, President Zelensky remains under pressure to this day. As Holmes testified, there are still things the Ukrainians want and need from the United States, including a meeting with the president in the Oval Office, which has still not been scheduled. And yes, Ukraine remains at war and needs U.S. military aid, including aid that is still delayed from last year. For these reasons, Mr. Holmes explained, quote, I think the Ukrainians are being very careful. They still need us now going forward. In fact, right now, President Zelensky is trying to arrange a summit meeting with President Putin in the coming weeks, his first face-to-face meeting with him to try to advance the peace process. He needs our support. He needs President Putin to understand that America supports Zelensky at the highest levels. So this doesn't end with the lifting of the security assistance hold. Ukraine still needs us, and as I said, still fighting this war this very day. When President Trump, for his own personal political gain, asked for a favor from President Zelensky, he did exactly what the framers feared most. He invited the influence of a foreign power into our elections. He used the power of his office to secure that advantage and jeopardized our national security. Yet President Trump maintains that he was always in the right and that his July 25th call with President Zelensky was perfect. President Trump has made it clear that he believes he is free to use his powers the same way, to the same ends, whenever and wherever he pleases. And even more troubling, he's even doubling down on his abuse, inviting other countries to interfere in our elections. What does all of this tell you? It tells you that Ambassador Sondland was correct when he told Holmes after hanging up with President Trump on July 26th that the president doesn't care about Ukraine. He only cares about the, quote, big stuff, meaning stuff that helps him personally. The bottom line is that the president used the powers of his office for personal political gain. He did so knowingly, deliberately, and repeatedly. And his misconduct continues to this day.
Senators, just for your orientation, this will be the last presentation on Article 1. And Mr. Leader, I think at the conclusion of this presentation will be a logical point to take a break. This last section on Article 1 deals with the injury to our national interest and our national security. When President Trump used Ukraine's leader for a political favor, and withheld critical military aid to an ally in exchange for that favor, he did exactly what our framers feared most. He invited foreign interference in our elections and sold out our country's security for his personal benefit and betrayed the nation's trust to a foreign power. The president's scheme to pressure Ukraine to do his political dirty work harmed our national security, undermined our free and fair elections, and even today, threatens the very foundation of our democracy. When the president argues that his call was perfect, that he did nothing wrong, what he's really saying is that there's nothing wrong with the president asking a foreign government to do a personal favor, that there's nothing wrong with the president pressuring that foreign country to interfere in our elections for his personal benefit, that there's nothing wrong with withholding congressionally appropriated, taxpayer-funded military assistance to that foreign country to extort that country to help the president cheat to win an election. But there are a great many things wrong with that. Most significant for the purposes that bring us here today, the Constitution does not permit it. And the Constitution does not permit it because that conduct is the quintessential abuse of power. The use of official power for personal gain, putting personal interest over the national interest, and placing personal benefits over our nation's security. The president's conduct that we outlined yesterday harmed our national security, that is without a doubt. It endangered our elections, and it sent our country on a dangerous path that, if left unchecked, will cause irrevocable damage to the balance of power contemplated in our Constitution. If someone sacrifices the national interest in favor of his own and is not removed from office, our democracy is in jeopardy. It's just that simple. The grave consequences of President Trump's misconduct demand our attention. Let me take these issues in turn, beginning with this harm to national security. First, the president's abuse of power had immediate consequences to our security. Ukraine is a burgeoning democracy entangled in a hot war with Russia. By withholding military aid, President Trump not only denied Ukraine much-needed military equipment, but also weakened Ukraine's position in negotiations over the end of the war with Russia. Because of President Trump's corrupt actions, Vladimir Putin was emboldened at a pivotal moment ahead of those sensitive negotiations to attempt to end the war. An emboldened Russia is a threat to the United States and global security around the world. The president's willingness to put himself over a country undercut our European allies' confidence in America's commitment to deterring Russian aggression. And it signaled to adversaries and friends alike that the President of the United States, the most powerful man in the world, our commander-in-chief, could be influenced by manipulating his perception of what was best for his personal interests. Now, I have no doubt that the Russians and probably every other nation that has the capacity does a psychological profile of the President of the United States, as we profile other leaders. If a president can be so easily manipulated to disbelieve his own intelligence agencies, to accept the propaganda of the Kremlin, that is a threat to our national security. And that is just what has happened here. But that's not all. President Trump's willingness to entangle our foreign allies in a corrupt political errand also undermined the credibility of Americans to promote the rule of law and fight corruption abroad. This is Trump first, not American first, not American ideals first. And the result has and will continue to be grave harm to our nation if this chamber does not stand up and say it is wrong. If you do not stand up and say this is not only wrong, not only unacceptable, but conduct incompatible with the office of the presidency. And if it really is incompatible with the office of the presidency, if you cannot faithfully execute that responsibility, if you cannot bring yourself to put your nation's interests ahead of your own, it must be impeachable, or the nation remains at risk. Let's consider the big picture here. And probably a question many people around the country are asking. Why does Ukraine matter to the United States? Why does Ukraine matter to the United States? Because we're talking about a small country that many people know very little about. Well, this small country, this ally of ours, is a country hungry for reform and eager for a stronger relation with its most powerful, important ally, the United States. And we're talking about ourselves and what it means to the strength of our own democracy and democracies around the world when countries like Ukraine are fighting our fight against authoritarianism. At least that used to be our fight. And God help us if it's not our fight still. Russian President Putin declared the collapse of the Soviet Union to be the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Ukraine's vote for independence in December 1991 was the final nail in the Soviet Union's coffin. That made Ukraine's greatest moment Putin's greatest tragedy. When it declared independence from Soviet domination, Ukraine inherited roughly 1,900 Soviet nuclear warheads, enough firepower to level every major American city several times over. 1,900 Soviet nuclear warheads. In exchange for Ukraine surrendering this arsenal, the United States, Russia, and the United Kingdom reached an understanding called the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. They committed in this memorandum to respecting the borders of an independent Ukraine and also to refrain from using the threat or use of force against Ukraine. This was an early success of the post-Cold War period. Despite its commitment to respect Ukraine's independence, of course, Russia continued to meddle in Ukraine's affairs. Ambassador Taylor recounted how events took an even more sinister turn in 2013.
The West. But in 2013, Vladimir Putin was so threatened by the prospect of Ukraine joining the European Union that he tried to bribe the Ukrainian president. This triggered mass protests in the winter of 2013 that drove that president to flee to Russia in February 2014, but not before his forces killed 100 Ukrainian protesters in central Kyiv.
Angered by the fall of the Kremlin-backed leader in Kyiv, President Putin ordered the invasion of Ukraine, specifically a region known as Crimea. Russia's aggression was met with global condemnation. We lack the sound there, but you can see the images of that conflict on the screens before you. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Laura Cooper testified as to the stakes for U.S. national security.
Russia violated the sovereignty of Ukraine's territory. Russia illegally annexed territory that belonged to Ukraine. They also denied Ukraine access to its naval fleet at the time, and to this day, Russia is building a capability on Crimea designed to expand Russian military power projection far beyond the immediate region.
In 2014, were there concerns in Washington, here in Washington, and European capitals that Russia might not stop in Ukraine?
I was not in my current position in 2014, but it is my understanding that there was significant fear about where a Russian aggression would stop.
One American, a war hero and statesman who is no stranger to this body, recognized the threat posed by Russia's invasion of Crimea, Senator John McCain. In an interview, he declared, quote, "We are all Ukrainians." Senator McCain advised that this is a chess match reminiscent of the Cold War, and we need to realize that and act accordingly. He was, of course, absolutely right. Consistent with the commitments made to Ukraine in 1994, the United States and Europe responded to Russia's invasion by imposing significant sanctions on Russia. We joined Europe in providing Ukraine billions of dollars in economic support to help it resist Russian influence. And the Senate approved by an overwhelming bipartisan majority vital security assistance to help rebuild Ukraine's military, which the former Russian-backed leader of Ukraine had starved of resources. This strong bipartisan support for Ukraine reflected what Senator McCain said was an opportunity for the United States to undermine Russian leverage in Eastern Europe by building, quote, a success in Ukraine. Senator McCain outlined this vision.
Putin also sees, here's this beautiful and large and magnificent country called Ukraine. And suppose Ukraine finally, after failing in 2004, gets it right, democracy, gets rid of corruption, economy's really improving, and it's right there on the border of Russia. And so I think it makes him very nervous if there were a success in Ukraine in bringing about a free and open society and economic success, which is not the case in Russia, as you know, which is propped up by energy.
Achieving the Ukrainian success that Senator McCain and many of us hoped for proved to be a daunting task. But several witnesses who testified before the House said Vladimir Zelensky's landslide election in April 2019 was a game changer. Here is how U.S. diplomat David Holmes explained the, quote, historic opportunity created by his election.
Despite the Russian aggression over the past 5 years, Ukrainians have rebuilt a shattered economy, adhered to a peace process, and moved economically and socially closer to the West, toward our way of life. Earlier this year, large majorities of Ukrainians again chose a fresh start by voting for a political newcomer as president, replacing 80% of their parliament, and endorsing a platform consistent with our democratic values, our reform priorities, and our strategic interests. This year's revolution at the ballot box underscores that despite its imperfections, Ukraine is a genuine and vibrant democracy and an example to other post-Soviet countries and beyond, from Moscow to Hong Kong.
Support for Ukraine's security and reform is critical not only to our own national security, but that to other allies and emerging democracies around the world. The widely accepted fact of Ukraine's importance to our national security makes President Trump's abuse of power and withholding of vital diplomatic and military support all the more disturbing. First, witnesses assess that withholding the military aid likely helped to prolong the war against Russia. When wars drag on, more people die. Ambassador Taylor testified to this sober reality.
I take it if the provision of U.S. military assistance to draw any direct Ukrainian armed forces to be effective and deter and to be able to
results in additional casualties.
As we sit here today, and 2 injured by Russian-led forces in eastern Ukraine despite a declared ceasefire. I learned overnight that 7 more were injured yesterday.
Withholding the aid has real consequences to real soldiers with real families. And bear in mind that U.S. aid is fully 10% of Ukraine's defense budget. 10%. That's not an extra bonus. That's necessary aid for Ukraine to defend itself on the front line. Now, a second consequence of President Trump's withholding of military assistance was that it emboldened Russia, our adversary. Here is Laura Cooper, a Pentagon official who oversaw the military aid.
What about today? If the U.S. were to withdraw its military support of Ukraine, what would effectively happen?
It is my belief that if we were to withdraw our support, it would embolden Russia. It would also validate Russia's violation of international law.
And which country stands to benefit the most, would stand to benefit the most from such a withdrawal?
Russia.
Russia was not only emboldened on the battlefield. Ambassador Taylor testified that President Trump's corrupt withholding of military assistance and his failure to host President Zelensky in the Oval Office was, quote, a sign of weakness to Moscow. And it harmed Ukraine's negotiating position even as recently as December 9, when Zelensky and Putin met to discuss the conflict in the East, shown in this photo. Ambassador Taylor explained,
I think you also testified that Russia was watching closely to gauge the level of American support for the Ukrainian government. Why is that significant?
This is significant, Mr. Chairman, because the Ukrainians, in particular under this new administration, are eager to end this war, and they are eager to end it in a way that the Russians leave their territory. These negotiations, like all negotiations, are difficult. Ukrainians would like to be able to negotiate from a position of strength, or at least more strength than they now have. Part of that strength, part of the ability of the Ukrainians to negotiate against the Russians, with the Russians for an end to the war in Donbass, depends on the United States and other international support. If we withdraw or suspend or threaten to withdraw our security assistance, that's a message to the Ukrainians, but it's at least as important, as your question indicates, Mr. Chairman, to the Russians, who are looking for any sign of weakness or any sign that we are withdrawing our support for Ukraine.
And so when the Ukrainians learned of the suspension of the military aid, either privately or when others learned publicly, the Russians would be learning also. And they would take that as a lack of robust U.S. support for Ukraine. Is that right?
That's correct, sir.
And that would weaken Ukraine in negotiating an end to the war in Donbass.
It would.
Indeed, the aid doesn't just supply much-needed weapons to Ukraine. It is a symbol of support, a signal of strength, a signal of the backing of the United States. And withholding that aid, even for a period of time, undermined all of those things. President Trump's actions towards Ukraine also undercut worldwide confidence in the United States as a reliable security partner. Maintaining that confidence is crucial to the strength of our alliances in Europe, to deterring Russia, and ultimately protecting and projecting democracy around the world. The United States has roughly 68,000 troops stationed in Europe. They serve alongside troops from 28 other countries that comprise the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. They are holding the line against further Russian aggression. It was U.S. leadership that led to the creation of NATO 70 years ago, as the Iron Curtain was descending across the heart of Europe. And it is American leadership that makes NATO work today. NATO is also effective because other countries, friends and foes alike, know that we are committed to our collective defense, that an attack against one nation is an attack against all of us. That principle deterred a Russian invasion of Europe during the Cold War. It's only been invoked once by NATO in the aftermath of the September 11th terrorist attacks. New York is a long way from the front lines with Russia, but our European allies stood with us after that dark day. They deployed tens of thousands of troops to Afghanistan and joined us in fighting the al-Qaeda terrorists who attacked the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. Now, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, but Russia's invasion of Ukraine was a threat to the peace and security of Europe. Moscow's aggression threatened the rules of the road that have kept the peace in Europe since World War II, the sacrosanct idea that borders cannot be changed by military force. If we had not supported Ukraine in 2014, if members of this body had not voted overwhelmingly on a bipartisan basis for military assistance to rebuild Ukraine's military, there is no question it would have invited further Russian adventurism in Ukraine and perhaps elsewhere in the heart of Europe. It would have weakened our allies and exposed U.S. troops stationed in Europe to greater danger. Deterring Russia requires persistence, not just one military aid package or one Oval Office meeting, but a sustained policy of support for our partners. We only deter Russia by consistently demonstrating support for our friends like Ukraine. George Shultz, who served as Ronald Reagan's Secretary of State, understood this. He compared diplomacy and alliance management to gardening. He said, quote, "If you plant a garden and go away for 6 months, what have you got when you come back? Weeds." Diplomacy, he said, is kind of like that. You go around, talk to people, you develop a relationship of trust and confidence, and then if something comes up, you have that base to work from. President Trump's decision to transform the military aid and Oval Office meeting into leverage was the equivalent of trampling all over George Shultz's garden, crushing Ukraine's confidence in the United States as a partner. He also caused our NATO allies to question whether we would stand with them against Russia. Leaders in European capitals now wonder whether personal political favors and not treaty obligations guide our foreign policy. Colleagues, this is how alliances wither and die, and how Russia wins. Ambassador Taylor made clear that is why it is so important to our security that we stand with Ukraine.
Mr. Chairman, as my colleague, Deputy Assistant Secretary George Kent described, we have a national security policy, a national defense policy that identifies Russia and China as adversaries. The Russians are violating all of the rules, treaties, understandings that they committed to that actually kept the peace in Europe for nearly 70 years. Until they invaded Ukraine in 2014, they had abided by sovereignty of nations, of inviolability of borders. That rule of law, that order that kept the peace in Europe and allowed for prosperity as well as peace in Europe was violated by the Russians. And if we don't push back on that, on those violations, then that will continue. And that, Mr. Chairman, affects us. It affects the world that we live in, that our children will grow up in, and our grandchildren. This affects the kind of world that we want to see abroad. So that affects our national interest very directly. Ukraine is on the front line of that conflict.
Now, we understood that in 2017, the first year of the Trump administration, and it appeared the Trump administration understood it as well. And we understood it in 2018, and the Trump administration understood that as well. And we understood that in 2019, and the Trump administration appeared to as well. At least it did until it didn't. It did until something of greater importance and significance came along, and that event of greater significance to the Oval Office was the emergence of Joe Biden as a candidate for president. And then that military support, which had increased during the Trump administration, was suddenly put on hold for inexplicable reasons. Ukraine got the message. It wasn't very inexplicable to Ukraine. And what's more, Russia got the message. It wasn't very inexplicable to Russia, that had pushed out the whole propaganda theory that it was Ukraine that had interfered in our election and not Russia. And so that consensus among the Congress and the administration, among the right and the left and the center, that as Ambassador Taylor explained, this is not only vital to Ukraine's security and the post-World War II order that has kept the peace in Europe for 70 years, but it's vital to us and our security as well. That all broke down. That all broke down over an effort led by the president and his agent, Rudy Giuliani, and his agents, Parnas and Fruman, to overturn all of that. Overturn a decades-long commitment to standing up to Russian aggression. We have so tremendously benefited. No country has benefited more from the international rules of the road, the international order, than the United States. It gave us the peace and stability to prosper like no other nation has before. And we're throwing it away. We're throwing it away. We're undermining the rule of law. We're undermining the principle you don't invade your neighbor. We're undermining the key to our own success. And for what? For help with a political campaign. To quote Bill Taylor, that's crazy. That's crazy. If our allies can't trust us to stand behind them in a time of need, we will soon not have a single ally left. Look, I know it's painful to see some of our allies and how they talk about this president, because when they talk about this president, they're also talking about the United States. And it's painful to see our allies distance themselves from the United States. And it's more than painful, it's dangerous. It's dangerous to us. I think it was Churchill once said, there's nothing worse than allies except having no allies. But if we're going to condition our support for our allies on their willingness to be dragged, kicking and screaming into our politics, if we're going to condition the strength of our alliance on whether they'll help us cheat in an election, we're not going to have a single ally left. And not a single one of us in this chamber is ever going to be able to say one of our counterparts to respect the rule of law without it being thrown in our face. Promoting the rule of law and fighting corruption is central to our foreign policy. It distinguishes U.S. global leadership from the transactional approach favored by authoritarian adversaries. The inherently corrupt nature of the president's demand that Ukraine investigate his political opponent undermined the credibility of efforts to promote the rule of law and combat corruption in Ukraine and around the world. Indeed, the president engaging in the very conduct at home that our policy fights abroad sabotages long-standing bipartisan pillars of American diplomacy. This was a problem, not least because the pervasive corruption with Ukraine leaves its politics and economy susceptible to Russian influence and subterfuge. Ambassador Yovanovitch emphasized that U.S. policy in Ukraine has long recognized that the struggle against corruption and defending against Russia are in fact two sides of the very same coin.
Corruption makes Ukraine's leaders ever vulnerable to Russia, and the Ukrainian people understand that. That's why they launched the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, demanding to be a part of Europe, demanding the transformation of the system, demanding to live under the rule of law. Ukrainians wanted the law to apply equally to all people, whether the individual in question is the president or any other citizen. It was a question of fairness, of dignity. Here again, there is a coincidence of interests. Corrupt leaders are inherently less trustworthy, while an honest and accountable Ukrainian leadership makes a U.S.-Ukrainian partnership more reliable and more valuable to the United States. A level playing field in this strategically located country, bordering 4 NATO allies, creates an environment in which U.S. business can more easily trade, invest, and profit. Corruption is also a security issue, because corrupt officials are vulnerable to Moscow.
During that conversation that we related in the past, when Ambassador Volker urged his Ukrainian counterpart, Andrei Yermak, not to investigate the past president of Ukraine, and Yermak threw it back in his face. You remember the conversation. Oh, you mean like the investigation you want us to do of the Clintons and the Bidens? They taught us something in that conversation. They taught us that we'd forgotten, for that moment, our own values. You know, just listening to the ambassador right now, I was thinking how interesting it is the Ukrainians chose to describe their revolution as a revolution of dignity. And maybe that's what we need here, a revolution of dignity at home. A revolution of civility here at home. Maybe we can learn a lot more from our Ukrainian ally. In short, it is America's national security interest to help Ukraine transform into a country where the rule of law governs and corruption is held in check. As we heard yesterday, anti-corruption policy was a central part of the talking points provided to President Trump before his phone calls with President Zelensky on April 21st and July 25th. President Trump, of course, didn't mention corruption, but importantly, those same foreign policy goals remained intact following the call. As Tim Morrison testified, anti-corruption reforms, institutional reforms remain a top U.S. priority to help Ukraine fight corruption. President Zelensky was swept into office on an anti-corruption platform. Immediately, he kept his promise and introduced numerous bills in Ukraine's parliament. In a sign that he intended to hold himself accountable, Zelensky even introduced a draft law on presidential impeachment. He also introduced a bill to restore punishment of top officials found guilty of illicit enrichment. President Trump's self-serving scheme threatened to undermine Zelensky's anti-corruption work. Zelensky's successful anti-corruption reforms would have advanced U.S. security. Instead, President Trump's demands undermined that effort to bring about reform to Ukraine. Here's George Kent, a rule of law and corruption expert at the State Department.
U.S. efforts to counter corruption in Ukraine focus on building institutional capacity so that the Ukrainian government has the ability to go after corruption and effectively investigate, prosecute, and judge alleged criminal activities using appropriate institutional mechanisms. That is, to create and follow the rule of law. That means that if there are criminal nexuses for activity in the United States, U.S. law enforcement should pursue the case. If we think there's been a criminal act overseas that violates U.S. law, we have the institutional mechanisms to address that. It could be through the Justice Department and FBI agents assigned overseas, or through treaty mechanisms, such as the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty. As a general principle, I do not believe the United States should ask other countries to engage in selective, politically associated investigations or prosecutions against opponents of those in power, because such selective actions undermine the rule of law, regardless of the country.
And so it's clear what President Trump did when abusing his office and demanding Ukraine open an investigation into Joe Biden was not fighting corruption. It was not part of established U.S. anti-corruption policy. That corrupt pressure campaign for his own personal political benefit, in fact, subverted U.S. anti-corruption efforts in Ukraine and undercut our national security. President Trump was not fighting to end corruption in Ukraine. As my colleague in the House, Mr. Himes, pointed out during one of our hearings, he was trying to aim corruption in Ukraine at Vice President Biden and our 2020 election. Selective, politically motivated prosecutions of political opponents undercut governance in Ukraine. President Trump's demand that Zelensky help him do precisely what U.S. diplomats for decades advised Ukrainian officials not to do completely undercut the credibility of efforts to promote the rule of law there. The demand also undercut the United States' moral standing and authority in the eyes of a global audience. Here, once again, is George Kent.
Ken, is pressuring Ukraine to conduct what I believe you've called political investigations a part of U.S. foreign policy to promote the rule of law in Ukraine and around the world?
It is not.
Is it in the national interest of the United States?
In my opinion, it is not.
Why not?
Because our policies, particularly in promoting the rule of law, are designed to help countries, and in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, that is overcoming the legacy of communism. In the communist system, in particular, the Prosecutor General Office was used to suppress and persecute citizens, not promote the rule of law. So in helping these countries reach their own aspirations to join the Western community of nations
and live lives of dignity, helping them have the rule of law with strong institutions is the purpose of our policy.
So in other words, it is a purpose of our foreign policy to encourage foreign nations to refrain from conducting political investigations. Is that right?
Correct. And in fact, as a matter of policy, not of programming, we oftentimes raise our concerns, usually in private, with countries that we feel are engaged in selective political prosecution and persecution of their opponents.
Yovanovitch aptly summarized the global consequences and harm to U.S. national security resulting from President Trump's demand that Ukraine investigate his political opponent.
Such conduct undermines the U.S., exposes our friends, and widens the playing field for autocrats like President Putin. Our leadership depends on the power of our example and the consistency of our purpose. Both have now been opened to question.
The issues I just covered are not a matter of policy disagreement over foreign policy and national security. Article 1 asserts that the President was engaged in no such policy at all, but instead sold out our policies and our national interests for his own personal gain and to help him corrupt the next election. That is the core conduct of an impeachable offense. The President's abuse of power also affected our election integrity. The framers of our Constitution were particularly fearful that a president might misuse or abuse the power of his office to undermine the free and fair elections at the heart of our democracy. Sadly, that moment has arrived. President Trump's repeated solicitation of a Ukrainian investigation was a clear effort to leverage foreign interference to bolster his prospects in the 2020 election. In other words, to cheat in his election. In our democracy, power flows from the will of the people as manifest in free and fair elections. One person, one vote is fundamental in our democracy. President Trump's invitation of foreign interference in the 2020 election for the purposes of helping him win an election undercut the Constitution's commitment to popular sovereignty. Americans are now left to wonder if their vote matters, or if they're simply pawns in a system being manipulated by shadowy foreign forces working on behalf of corrupt interests of a lawless president. Over the long term, this weakens our democratic system's capacity for self-governance by encouraging apathy and non-participation. Cynicism makes it easier for enemies to influence our politics and undermine the national good. Indeed, this is precisely what Vladimir Putin intended when he meddled in the 2016 election, for us to become more cynical, for us to lose faith in the notion that the American system of government is superior to the corrupt, autocratic model of government that he has erected in Russia and sought to export to places like Ukraine. These are not the free and fair elections Americans expect or demand if foreign powers are interfering. How can we know that our elections are free from foreign interference, whether by disinformation or hacking or fake investigations? We must not become numb to foreign interference in our elections. Our elections are sacred. If we do not act to put an end to the solicitation of foreign interference in our election by the President of the United States, the effect will be corrosive to our elections and our values. Future presidents may believe that they, too, can use the substantial power conferred on them by the Constitution in order to undermine our system of free and fair elections. That they, too, can cheat to obtain power or keep it. That way lies disaster for the great American experiment in self-governance. As you have seen, there is powerful evidence that President Trump will continue to betray the national interest to a foreign power and further undermine both our security and democracy. This creates an urgent need to remove him from office before the next election. To explain the nature of that continuing threat, let me describe Russia's ongoing efforts to harm our elections. The President's corrupt refusal to condemn or defend against those attacks. His statements confirming that he welcomes foreign interference in our elections, so long as this is meant to help him, and his conduct proving that he will persist in seeking to corrupt elections at the expense of our security and at the expense of those elections. Let's start with Russia's ongoing attacks on our democracy. At the heart of the president's Ukraine scheme is his decision to subscribe to that dangerous conspiracy theory that Ukraine, not Russia, was responsible for interfering in 2016. President Trump and his men pressured Ukraine into investigating this bogus piece of Russian propaganda, and in doing so, they aided Putin's concerted plot to undermine our security and democracy. Special Counsel Mueller warned that Putin's plot was ongoing.
Is this, in your investigation, did you think that this was a single attempt by the Russians to get involved in our election, or did you find evidence to suggest they'll try to do this again?
No, it wasn't a single attempt. They're doing it as we sit here. And they expect to do it during the next campaign.
Not a single attempt. They're doing it as we sit here, and they expect to do it in the next campaign. That was Special Counsel Mueller's stark warning. And we now know that Director Mueller was right. Just the other week, we saw public reporting that Russian hackers may be using phishing emails to attack the Ukrainian gas company Burisma, presumably in search of dirt on Joe Biden. Those are the same tactics deployed by the same adversary, Russia, that Special Counsel warned about in the last election. It may be Russia once again attempting to sway our election for one candidate, this time through Ukraine. Indeed, President Trump, to this very day, refuses to accept the unanimous assessment of our intelligence community and law enforcement professionals that Russia interfered in the 2016 campaign and poses a threat to the 2020 presidential election. Instead, he views it from his own personal lens, whether it is an attack on the legitimacy of his 2016 electoral victory. Special Counsel Mueller's testimony on July 24, 2019, the day before the president's call with President Zelensky, contradicted President Trump's claim that his was, quote, a clean campaign. Mueller found that individuals associated with the 2016 campaign of the president welcomed Russia's offers of assistance and adjusted their political strategy so that then candidate Donald Trump might benefit from Russia's assistance. When they were subsequently asked by U.S. law enforcement about their activities, President Trump's advisors repeatedly lied. In Helsinki in July of 2018, however, President Trump refused to acknowledge the Russian threat to our elections. When a reporter explicitly asked whether he believed Putin or the U.S. intelligence agencies on the issue of foreign interference in the 2016 election, President Trump said, quote, I don't see any reason why it would be Russia, and talked about the DNC server.
So let me just say that we have two thoughts. You have groups that are wondering why the FBI never took the server. Why haven't they taken the server? Why was the FBI told to leave the office of the Democratic National Committee? I've been wondering that. I've been asking that for months and months, and I've been tweeting it out and calling it out on social media. Where is the server? I want to know, where is the server, and what is the server saying? With that being said, all I can do is ask the question. My people came to me, Dan Coates came to me, and some others. They said they think it's Russia. I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this, I don't see any reason why it would be, but I really do want to see the server. But I have confidence in both parties. I really believe that this will probably go on for a while, but I don't think it can go on without finding out what happened to the server. What happened to the servers of the Pakistani gentlemen that worked on the DNC? Where are those servers? They're missing. Where are they? What happened to Hillary Clinton's emails? 33,000 emails, gone, just gone. I think in Russia they wouldn't be gone so easily. I think it's a disgrace that we can't get Hillary Clinton's 33,000 emails. So
I'm sure you remember this. It was, I think, unforgettable for every American, but I'm sure it was equally unforgettable for Vladimir Putin. I mean, there he is, the president of Russia, standing next to the president of the United States and hearing his own Kremlin propaganda talking points coming from the president of the United States. Now, if that's not a propaganda coup, I don't know what is. It's the most extraordinary thing. It's the most extraordinary thing. The president of the United States standing next to the president of Russia, our adversary, saying he doesn't believe his own intelligence agencies. He doesn't believe them. He's promoting this kooky, crazy server theory cooked up by the Kremlin, right next to the guy that cooked it up. It's a breathtaking success of Russian intelligence. I don't know if there's ever been a greater success of Russian intelligence. Whatever profile Russia did of our president, boy, did they have him spot on. Flattery and propaganda. Flattery and propaganda is all Russia needed. And as to Ukraine, well, they needed to deliver a political investigation to get help from the United States. I mean, this is just the most incredible propaganda coup. Because as I said yesterday, it's not just that the President of the United States standing next to Vladimir Putin is reading Kremlin talking points. He won't read his own national security staff talking points, but he will read the Kremlin ones. But it's not just that he adopts the Kremlin talking points. That would be bad enough. It's not bad enough, it's not damaging enough, it's not dangerous enough to our national security that he's undermining our own intelligence agencies. It's not bad enough that he undermines those very agencies that he needs later, that we need later to have credibility. We've just had a vigorous debate over the strikes against General Soleimani. And the president has made his argument about what the intelligence says and supports. How do you make those arguments when you say the U.S. intelligence community can't be believed? Now, we've had a vigorous debate about what that intelligence has to say. That's not the issue here. The issue here is you undermine the credibility of your own intelligence agencies. You weaken the country for when you need to rely on them, for when you need to persuade your friends and your allies. You can trust us when we tell you this is what the intelligence shows. How do you make that argument as the President of the United States when you've just told the world you trust the Russians more than your own people? You trust Rudy Giuliani more than Christopher Wray. How do you make that case? And if you can't make that case, what does that mean to our security? But that's not the end of it. It's not just a propaganda coup. It's not just the undermining of our agencies. It's also that the buy-in to that propaganda meant that Ukraine wasn't going to get money to fight the Russians. I mean, that's one hell of a Russian intelligence coup. They got the President of the United States to provide cover for their own interference with our election. They got the President of the United States to discredit his own intelligence agencies. They got the President of the United States to drive a wedge between the United States and Ukraine. They got the President of the United States to withhold aid from Ukraine in a war with Russia, in a war that is claiming Ukrainian lives every week. Has there ever been such a coup? I would submit to you, in the entire length of the Cold War, the Soviet Union had no such success. No such success. And why? Because a former mayor of New York persuaded a president of the United States to sacrifice all of that for a cheap shot at his political opponent, for a smear against his political opponent. Was it worth it? I hope it was worth it. I hope it was worth it for the president, because it certainly wasn't worth it for the United States. Now, you can see President Trump did not blame Vladimir Putin and the Russian intelligence agencies who interfered in our election for the questions surrounding his victory. He did not blame the people who worked for his campaign and were subsequently convicted of lying to our law enforcement agencies. No, he blamed the investigators. Special Counsel Mueller, the man charged with getting to the bottom of Russia's interference in 2016. And he chose to believe Vladimir Putin, a former Russian intelligence officer, rather than his own intelligence agencies. We can see a pattern here. President Trump solicited interference from Russia as a candidate in 2016, and then his campaign welcomed Russian interference in the election. In Helsinki, President Trump chose to believe Putin over his own agencies. I don't see any reason why it would be, referring to Russia. Instead of denouncing Russia's interference, he denounced those investigating Russia's interference. And he raised that now familiar DNC CrowdStrike server thing. I really do want to see the server. I don't think we can go on without finding out what happened to the server. That's the exact same server that President Trump demanded Ukraine investigate during his July 25th call to Zelensky. When the president talked about the DNC server in Helsinki with Vladimir Putin standing by his side, he was referencing the same discredited conspiracy theory about Ukraine interference in 2016 that Putin repeatedly promoted. Let's look at this Washington Post article from July 2018. In the end, Trump's performance alongside Putin in the Finnish capital seemed like a tour through his most controversial conspiracy theories. Tweets and off-the-cuff musings on Russia, except he did it all while abroad, standing just feet from Putin, the leader of one of America's greatest geopolitical foes. Spectacle in Helsinki also underscored Trump's eagerness to disregard his own advisors, his willingness to flout the conclusions of his own intelligence community that Russia interfered in the 2016 elections, and his apparent fear that pressing Putin on the subject might cast doubt on his electoral victory. White House officials told the Washington Post that President Trump's remarks in Helsinki were, quote, very much counter to the plan. That's another understatement of the century. If that sounds familiar, it's because the witness who testified before the House as part of the impeachment inquiry, they all said the same thing about the July 25th phone call. The president ignored vital national security issues he was supposed to raise and instead raised disproven conspiracies about 2016 and the DNC server, the very same Russian propaganda he publicly endorsed in Helsinki. Do you think it's going to stop now? Do you think if we do nothing, it's going to stop now? All of the evidence is to the contrary. You know it's not going to stop. The president just told one of the members of this body he still wants Biden investigated. It's not going to stop unless the Congress does something about it. President Trump's betrayal began in 2016 when he first solicited Russian interference in our election.
Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing.
That betrayal continued in Helsinki in 2018, when, as we saw, he rejected the intelligence community's assessment about Russian interference in that same election. when he criticized U.S. officials investigating the Russia interference and instead promoted Putin's conspiracy theory about Ukraine. The betrayal continued in 2019 when he carried out a scheme to cheat in the 2020 election by demanding that the leader of Ukraine, a U.S. partner under military attack by Russia, announce an investigation into the same baseless conspiracy theory about a DNC server and the bogus allegations about Vice President Biden. And the abuse of power continues. He is still trying to cheat in the next election. Even after the scheme came to light, even after it became the subject of an impeachment inquiry, it continued. And the false statements about it continued. President Trump repeatedly asserted that he had a prerogative to urge foreign nations to investigate U.S. citizens who dare to challenge him politically. You know, just for a minute, we should try to step into the shoes of someone else. My father used to say, you don't understand a person until you step in their shoes. I always thought he invented that wisdom himself until I watched To Kill a Mockingbird and found out that Atticus Finch said it first. But let's just try to step into someone else's shoes for a moment. Let's imagine it wasn't Joe Biden. Let's imagine it was any one of us. Let's imagine the most powerful person in the world was asking a foreign nation to conduct a sham investigation into one of us. What would we think about it then? Would we think that's good U.S. policy? Would we think he has every right to do it? Would we think that's a perfect call? Let's step for a minute into Ambassador Yovanovitch's shoes. And we're the subject of a vicious smear campaign that no one in the department that we work for, up to the Secretary of State, thinks has a shred of credibility. Let's step into her shoes for a minute. Spent our whole life devoted to public service, served in dangerous places around the world. And we're hounded out of our post. And one day someone releases a transcript of a call between the President of the United States and a foreign leader, and the President says there's gonna be some things happening to you, or to you, or to you, or to you, or to you. How would you feel about the President of the United States? Would you think he was abusing the power of his office? And if you would, it shouldn't matter that it wasn't you. It shouldn't matter that it was Marie Yovanovitch. It shouldn't matter that it was Joe Biden. Because I'll tell you something, the next time, it just may be you. It just may be you. Do you think for a moment that any of you, no matter what your relationship with this president, no matter how close you are to this president, do you think for a moment that if he felt it was in his interest, he wouldn't ask you to be investigated? Do you think for a moment that he wouldn't? And if somewhere deep down below you realize that he would, you cannot leave a man like that in office when he has violated the Constitution. Shouldn't matter it was Joe Biden. Could have been any of us. It may be any of us. Shouldn't matter that it was Marie Yovanovitch. It'll be some other diplomat tomorrow for some other pernicious reason. Goes to what Mr. Jeffries said, it goes to character. You don't realize how important character is in the highest office in the land until you don't have it. Until you have a president willing to use his power to coerce an ally, to help him cheat, to investigate one of our fellow citizens. One of our fellow citizens. Yes, he's running for president. He's still a U.S. citizen. He's still a U.S. citizen. And he deserves better than that. Now, of course, it wasn't just Ukraine. It wasn't just Russia. There's the invitation to China to investigate the Bidens. It's not going to stop. On September 19th, Rudy Giuliani was interviewed on Chris Cuomo and CNN. You've probably all seen the clip. When asked specifically if he had urged Ukraine to look into Vice President Biden, Mr. Giuliani replied immediately, "Of course I did. Of course I did." It shouldn't matter that it was Joe Biden. Wasn't Hunter Biden there? It was Joe Biden. Wasn't Hunter Biden on that call? It was Joe Biden. But it shouldn't matter whether it's Hunter Biden or Joe Biden. We're talking about American citizens. It shouldn't matter to any of us which American citizens. And he hasn't stopped urging Ukraine to conduct these investigations. Mr. Giuliani hasn't. Donald Trump hasn't. To the contrary, and consistent with everything we know about the president, he has done nothing but double down. During his the first week of December, Mr. Giuliani traveled to Ukraine and Hungary to interview the corrupt former Ukrainian prosecutors who had been pushing these false narratives about Vice President Biden and this kooky conspiracy about 2016. Mr. Giuliani met with current members of the Ukraine parliament who have advocated for that same fraudulent investigation. June of last year, President Trump told ABC News that he would take political dirt from a foreign country if he was offered it again. If he has learned anything from the tumult of the last 3 years, it is he can get away with anything. He can do it again. Can't be indicted, can't be impeached. Can't, if you believe our Attorney General, even be investigated. Our founders worried about a situation just like this. James Madison put it simply, the president, quote, might betray his trust to foreign powers. In his farewell address, George Washington warned Americans to be constantly awake, since history and experience prove that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government. John Adams, in a letter to Thomas Jefferson, wrote, "You are apprehensive of foreign interference, intrigue, influence, so am I. But as often as elections happen, the danger of foreign influence recurs." Or, to quote the president's chief of staff, get over it. There's going to be politics in foreign policy. Well, I don't think that was John Adams' point. And I don't think that was James Madison's point, and I don't think that was George Washington's point. If it was, they would have said, get over it. But they recognized, as I know we recognized, what a profound danger that would be, for that to become the new normal. Another election is upon us. 10 months, voters will undertake their most important duty as citizens by going to the polls and voting for their leader. And so we must ask, what role will foreign powers play in trying to influence the outcome? And if they take the president's side, who will protect our franchise if the president will not? As charged in the first article of impeachment, President Trump has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to national security and the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-governance and the rule of law. Based on the abuse of power for which he was impeached and his ongoing efforts to solicit foreign interference, both directly and through Mr. Giuliani, there can be little doubt that President Trump will continue to invite foreign interference in our elections again and again. That poses an imminent threat to the integrity of our democracy. Our founders understood that a president like Donald Trump might one day grasp the reins of power. an unremorseful, overreaching executive, faithful to himself only, and willing to sacrifice our democracy and national security for his own personal advantage. His pattern of conduct, repeatedly soliciting foreign interference in our elections for his own benefit, confirms that he will stop at nothing to retain his power. He willfully chose to place his own personal interests above the country's and the integrity of our elections. There is every reason to believe that will continue. He has stonewalled Congress and ordered executive branch agencies, organizations that work for the American people, not for the president, to join in his obstruction. He deployed Mr. Giuliani to Ukraine to continue advancing a scheme that serves no other purpose than advancing his 2020 re-election prospects. He attacked witnesses, public servants, patriots who stayed true to their oath and leveled with the American people about the grave national injury that resulted from the president's misconduct. And he continued to urge foreign nations to investigate American citizens that he views as a threat. The threat that he will continue to abuse his power and cause grave harm to the nation over the course of the next year until a new president is sworn in or until he would be reelected is not hypothetical. Merely exposing the president's scheme has not stopped him from continuing this destructive pattern of behavior that has brought us to this somber moment. He is who he is. That will not change, and nor will the danger associated with him. Every piece of evidence supports that terrible conclusion, that the President of the United States will abuse his power again, that he will continue to solicit foreign interference to help corruptly secure his reelection. He has shown neither remorse nor acknowledgement of wrongdoing. If you can believe that July 25th was a perfect call, that asking for investigations of your political opponents and using the power of your office to make it so is perfectly fine, then there is nothing that would stop you from doing it again. President Trump has abused the power of his office and must be removed from that office. Mr. McConnell, I yield back.
The majority leader is recognized.
Mr. Chief Justice, I suggest a 15-minute recess.
Without objection, so ordered.